So today's conversation is on the wheel of yoga. And what is the wheel of yoga? So when I when I wrote down the description for this live, I put yoga history, wheel of yoga, but it could also be yoga philosophy, wheel of yoga. For those interested in yoga philosophy or yoga history, to me, they're very much intertwined, like they're very much combined. And if you decide to study yoga history after 200 hours or into your further studies, you'll realize that a lot of yoga history is also yoga philosophy. So the wheel of yoga is part of the history, but it's also part of the philosophy of the system of yoga. So the reason why I love to talk about the wheel of yoga is because the wheel of yoga is basically a graphic that explains the paths of yoga, or the yoga paths, or in a way I like to also call it the yoga journeys. And so if you're just tuning in for this live, I have attached the image of the wheel of yoga to the weekly live post. It should just be a couple of posts down on Facebook group. You can see the wheel of yoga, but it's basically is basically showing us that there are different ways to achieve enlightenment. And let's talk about enlightenment for a second, because enlightenment can be a very loaded word. When we talk about enlightenment, sometimes personally, I feel that it relates to magic, or it relates to something that is beyond our achievement as human beings, according to the way that the yogis throughout history have explained what enlightenment is. But if you really think about it, one way that I like to describe it, or at least understand for myself, is transcending the ego. As simple as that. Is a place where you get in your life, in your practice, in your journey, in which you can transcend the ego. And not that the ego is a negative thing altogether, because for us to live as human beings and to work and to survive in this world, sometimes we need our ego to push us forward and to do things that we need to do to continue living. But I think is transcending the ego in a way that stops taking over our lives, stops taking over ourselves. And according to the system of yoga, it is said that when we come into this world, our ego automatically is attached to us and is sort of like the default setting that comes with ourselves. So the idea is that through these different practices of, or these different paths of yoga that I'm going to describe briefly in a moment, it is through these different paths of yoga that we can transcend the ego. And that is, I would say, sort of like the bottom line of what it means to achieve enlightenment. Now, the actual achievement of enlightenment is depends on the system, depends on the lineage, depends on the path of yoga you're talking about, or you're reading, or you're studying, but everyone describes it a little bit different. Now, in the wheel of yoga, the center of the wheel of yoga, it is moksha, the word moksha. And moksha is like the end goal and the thing to achieve. And actually, according to who you're studying, my favorite person to study, my favorite teacher that talks about this is Georg Feuerstein. Georg Feuerstein, he wrote this great book called the Yoga Tradition, and it's a bit of a phone book, like very thick for those that remember phone books from the 90s. So it's a very thick book, but is a great long read. I'm still reading it. A long read introduction for the system of yoga. So in Georg Feuerstein book, and I'm taking some of his courses too, he talks about enlightenment being separated from moksha. So as I mentioned before, moksha is like the nucleus of the wheel of yoga circle graphic. And then surrounding that nucleus is enlightenment. Moksha, enlightenment is around it. So it is said that enlightenment is one part of the system of yoga, of one level of achieving moksha. So enlightenment is not the end. Some schools of yoga see moksha within enlightenment. So enlightenment is, or moksha is sort of like the last stage of enlightenment. Other schools of yoga separate the two. Enlightenment is the last stage of the system, and then you achieve moksha, which is beyond a stage, beyond a level. It is pure consciousness. It is unification with everything else. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. It is a very loaded topic when it comes to enlightenment, but I would prefer to spend this time talking about the actual system and pathways to that. And again, as I said before, it relates to yoga philosophy and to yoga history. So this is moksha, the nucleus of, if you imagine a wheel, moksha is in the center of the nucleus. Enlightenment or samadhi is running the nucleus. And then you have all these branches coming out. And according to, again, the person you study or what you're reading or who your teacher is, there could be 6 paths of yoga, or 7, or 8. And I'm just going to keep it in the middle. I'm going to keep it at 7. So just negotiating between 6 and 8. So again, either 6, 7, or 8. So now I'm gonna mention the 7 paths of yoga. Actually, I'm gonna mention the 6 first, the 6 paths of yoga. I'm just gonna say the names in Sanskrit, whether you know or feel that these names are familiar or not. I'm gonna say them, and then I'm gonna explain each of them. So we have Raja, Tantra, Karma, Mantra, Hatha, Bhakti, and Jnana. I actually just mentioned the 7. I'm going to repeat that, and I'm going to skip 1 to keep the 6, which is sort of like the first theory of the 6 paths of yoga. Raja, Karma, Mantra, Hatha, Bhakti, Jnana. That's 6. The 7th that has been added is Tantra. And the 8th that has been added is Kundalini. But a lot of schools don't see Kundalini as one of the paths of yoga. Instead, they see Kundalini as together with Tantra. And the folks that sort of like to think about the 6 paths of yoga, they see Tantra as together with Hatha. So I'll repeat: Raja, Karma, Mantra, Hatha, Bhakti, Jnana. 6. Tantra could be 7, but Tantra could also be added to Hatha, and Kundalini could be 8, but Kundalini could be added to Tantra, could be added to Hatha. So now let's talk about the wheel of yoga in relationship to those names. If I were to list these 6 or 7 or 8 names in a list, they become very separated. Like if you imagine a list going from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But what the wheel of yoga does is that we have the nucleus, which is moksha. We have surrounding the nucleus, which is enlightenment or samadhi. And then we have these branches coming out, which is hatha, karma, mantra, jnana, bhakti. So instead of being a list, is a wheel with branches. And the wheel with branches, what does it mean? It means that they are all at the same level. They are all equal. They are all valid. They are all the same in a way. So they are different ways. There is not one that is better than the other. There are just 6 or 7 different ways to achieve enlightenment. And why are there 6 different ways to achieve enlightenment according to the system of yoga? That is a great question. Because everyone is different. And even from thousands of years ago, when the yogis began to come up with this information, and by the way, this information for about 2,000 years was never written down in books. This information was passed on from teacher to student through oral chants and verses. All the information in the traditional system of yoga, which actually is rooted in the foundation of the Vedas. The Vedas is beyond religion. The Vedas is the foundation for the Hindu culture. It is pre-Hindu culture. The Vedas contain all this information, and it evolved, and all these branches started to emerge. But the idea from the Vedas, think of like 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, it could be older. It's just based on the archaeological findings that science has discovered, but it doesn't mean that the Vedas are 4,000 years old. Could be older. So these are and again, these are, as I said, these are not written down. They are some of them are verses that maybe were written down, but as a whole thing written down just happened 2,000 years ago. But the Vedas were part of the culture, was images, was knowledge that was passed on from person to person. Depictions here and there, verses, depictions of verses written here and there, but nothing sort of cohesive until later on. That's why we think they could be older. So the Vedas is the foundation for all this knowledge, and simply there wasn't division at the time. Really, yoga was sitting in contemplation and surrounding that contemplation through rituals of sacrifice. And these rituals of sacrifice, if you have ever gone to India or if you have gone to Bali, any Hindu culture place, anything can be a sacrifice, mostly offerings, food, basically things that we use ourselves as humans for survival. They give them they offer them, they burn them, they put them in water, they disappear. These are different ways to sacrifice things that we could use for ourselves. We're sacrificing them to offering them, especially for higher beings, technically, basically. So that was the foundation of yoga, was contemplation surrounding by rituals. And then as this knowledge started to evolve, there started to be more teachers, there started to be more lineages. That's when we start to see these differentiations of the system into these 6 or 7 different paths of yoga. And so let's quickly talk about each of them. Again, these are all valid. These are basically different ways of learning. If we look at our world today, and the way that now through psychology we're trying to figure out the way that children learn, the way to sort of like the architecture of schools these days are changing slowly just to accommodate more different kinds of intelligences. So let's call that different ways of achieving something, because everybody is different. Everybody has a different kind of intelligence. So the most traditional one, the most classic, which is the one that we touch in the 200 hours in this course, is Raja Yoga. And Raja is the system of Patanjali, the Yoga Sutras. And before I continue, actually, I just want to say that a lot of, if you were to break, let's say, the 8 limbs of yoga from Patanjali, and we have the yamas and niyamas, we have asana, pranayama, withdrawal of the senses, meditation, concentration, samadhi, all that, we can see that parts of these different systems of yoga are also in the other paths of yoga. So the 8 limbs of yoga is just a way for Patanjali to give us a system and call it Raja Yoga, but it doesn't mean that it's the only system. Little things from this system also happen in karma, in mantra, in hatha, in bhakti, in jnana yoga. So Raja Yoga, system of Patanjali, and it is concerned mostly with meditation. Yeah, so you do all this and you practice yamas and niyamas in order to achieve a level of meditation that would eventually take you into a level of enlightenment, that will eventually take you into a level of moksha, which is absorption with everything else. It is beyond levels, it is beyond enlightenment. Then we got karma yoga. Karma yoga also, and all these paths of yoga are mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita, some of them more than others. The Vedas conclude with the Upanishads. So the Upanishads, let's say the Vedas was the beginning, let's say 4,000 years ago. 2,000 years later, the conclusion was the Upanishads, which is about 2,000 years ago. So the Upanishads are also a group of verses that took the Vedas into a more systematic way, easier to understand for that period, for the people at the time. And so then all these different systems of paths of yoga are mentioned in all these different scriptures. So we just briefly talk about Raja. Karma is talked about in the Bhagavad Gita. Karma is about, this one is an interesting one because karma is a word used a lot in our language. But I think we're using it wrong, because when we do something that might have consequences, actually everything has consequences. But when we do something bad and we say that it has consequences, then in a way we call that is karma, when it gets back to us, when something bad happens to us, because of karma. But really that is just a redefinition of the actual word, the true meaning of karma. Karma is basically selfless action. So you do something because it is within you, within your true nature to do it, without expecting anything in return. As simple as that. And it's the hardest thing to do, because in our world today, we are always, or personally, a lot of the time myself, back in the back of my mind, I'm like, maybe I can get this from, if I do this, I can get this as well. So there's always that negotiation of, sort of like doing something because we also want something else. So the idea is that karma is just pure selfless action, simple as that. And the reason why it's so hard is because in our default programming, we have already established that a lot of the times we do something for the sake of, we do something because we want something in return, as opposed to doing something from our true self just for the sake of doing it. And it happens. It can happen. Obviously, it's not impossible, but is the yoga is to get to that place. The yoga journey is to get to that place. So we got Raja, we got Karma, Mantra Yoga, related to sound, sacred sound. Om is part of Mantra Yoga. All these verses, people, mantra yogis, got together and sang these verses for days without stopping. That was a way of achieving enlightenment, eventually then achieving moksha to them. Hatha, which is again, whoever, depending of who you study, hatha and tantra could either be chicken or the egg, which one came first, hatha or tantra, tantra or hatha, and which one belongs to which one. And Kundalini is also part of that. Kundalini is also sometimes named its own, but sometimes also separated from Tantra and Hatha and Tantra. And again, this is our society separating things and labeling things. But truly, these things, the idea is that all this was meant to be understood without the labels. It's just understood from your true self, which is the yoga, is the process of getting there eventually. We like to label things, we like to differentiate, we like to be separate from the rest. It is in our sort of like default way of being, and that is what yoga is inviting us not to do, is to acknowledge that, but know that we are beyond that separation, that we are unified with the rest. So let's see. So Hatha Yoga or Tantra is concerned with not just the body, but is including the body into the group. So the Raja Yogis were like, hey, let's transcend our mind, let's meditate, let's achieve a level of enlightenment. Karma Yogis were, just through actions we can achieve enlightenment. Mantra Yogis were like, just through sound we can achieve enlightenment. But it was concerned a lot with the mind, the transcendation of the ego and the mind, not so much about the body. But the Hatha Yogis discovered that the Hatha Yogis discovered that you don't have to. So before I go there, let me go back to Raja Karma Mantra. A lot of these philosophies believe that enlightenment could happen after we stop living. So it's like we gather all these good things that we are creating in our life or lives, for those also that believed in reincarnation in the tradition, and then eventually we'll die, and then we find samadhi, enlightenment, and moksha. However, the Hatha Yogis were like, wait a minute, we also believe that we can achieve enlightenment while being alive, and moksha while being alive. And because of that, it is actually a very tough process for the body. So, because it's such a tough process for the body to achieve enlightenment while you are alive, we need a system that incorporates the strengthening and the purification of the body. So that is basically Hatha Yoga, Tantra Yoga, Kundalini, all those could be together, sometimes they're separated. And then we've gone through Raja, Karma, Mantra, Hatha, Bhakti, and Jnana. So Bhakti has to do a lot with emotions, and it is known that Bhakti yogis are known for being the most expressive of all of them, because they incorporate the emotions into their rituals, into their rituals, but also into the way that they act into the system. So crying, anger, showing your emotions, basically you are unifying your emotions with the rest. You are if there is a God involved, you are loving at the same time as you're hating that God. You're so absorbed with this God that it is, you're giving all your emotional self to this entity. But on the other hand, they are never saying that they are going to be one. They are always separating themselves from this higher entity. And so Bhakti Yoga has a lot of rituals. And then Jnana Yoga talks about a couple different things. Now, I've mentioned all these different branches of the yoga, traditional yoga system, and all of them would have meditation, and all of them would have different aspects of yamas and the niyamas, and all of them would have different aspects of concentration and different ways of explaining absorption and samadhi and moksha and enlightenment and all that kind of stuff. So the last one, Jnana, is all about, it has a big part on contemplation and meditation, but it's all about discernment and realizing for yourself from your true nature, not from your consciousness, but from your true nature, which is beyond consciousness, realizing the difference between true and reality. So reality, the way that we see, the way that the things that we can touch, it is part of nature, but it's not part of whatever is beyond nature. It's not part of whatever happens after matter has been changed or destroyed. I mean, matter is not really destroyed, but after matter is no longer there, it has become something else. There's always going to be something beyond that. So is that higher mind that belongs to that thing that is beyond nature, as opposed to our mind right now that we have in our bodies that helps us to, differentiate between a dog and a cat, or differentiate between math and physics. So is beyond that, is really realizing, differentiating, knowing from a true self what really reality is and what is part of just matter and your nature for being physical in this realm or this dimension. So it's a lot about your gut feeling versus your brain telling you what to do. Is a lot about, through contemplation, achieving this, through knowledge of the scriptures also is a way to achieve this. And a big part of it, and I read this from a sort of like a teacher that a famous yogi teacher that I forgot whose name is, but basically a lot about asking yourself who I am. And if you sit down and in your meditation and you ask yourself who I am without having to wait for an answer, you're going to eventually find out with practice who you are really from a true self. And the idea of knowing, oh, I know, oh yeah, I know that that's bad for you, I know that that's good for me, is the idea that they want us to take us away from. When you say, I know, do you truly know? Or is it based on your experience and your upbringing and your programming that you think you know? Even science, we think they know. So a lot of things are based on we think we know because of our research of this, and is a way of us using the word to know. But to know, according to the Jnana yoga tradition, is beyond that, is to know from a place of higher mind and true self, as opposed to knowing from based on research or programming or upbringing or cultural upbringing or family and all that identity. So they are saying you're beyond all that. It is different to know from a place of the true self. So that is our lecture for today. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, put them down. I'm gonna also try to make sure that the wheel of yoga image is there as well. And thank you so much for joining me today. And it is always so lovely to share this information, which is part of universal knowledge. It's not new. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. The light in me sees the light in you. Thank you, everyone.